The fog is lifting. Clarity is calling you forward. Welcome to Forward in Freedom. I'm Tanya Johnson. This is where awareness becomes power. Let's move forward in freedom. Come sit down in the room. We have something to talk about today. Before we begin, I want to just ask a question. When did we stop being curious? I've been noticing something about us. We can be so quick to decide that we already know. We know what somebody meant. We know why they did it. We know how the conversation is going to go. We know what that opportunity will look like. We know what somebody is going to say before they finish saying it. And then I started wondering, what happens when we become so certain about what we know that we stop making room for what we don't know? Because there's a difference between having wisdom and having an answer for everything. And sometimes we simply don't know. And maybe that's where something interesting begins. I want you to think about a little child. You can spend 5 minutes with a child, and I guarantee you're going to hear, why? Why? But why? How? What happens if? They really want to know. They're exploring, they're trying to understand the world around them. And then somewhere along the way, we become adults and something changes. We ask fewer questions. We make more assumptions. We start filling in the blanks. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. And you know what I find interesting? We can take a tiny piece of information and build an entire elaborate story around it. Someone is quiet, we decide that they're upset with us. Someone doesn't return our call, we decide they're ignoring us. Someone changes jobs, we decide they couldn't handle the job. Someone gets promoted, we decide they must have known somebody. Someone disagrees with us, we decide they don't understand. And sometimes we're right, but sometimes we're not. Maybe you're sitting across from me right now and you can think of a person. You already have them figured out. You already know how they are. You know what they mean. You know what they're going to do. And because you already know, you don't really need to ask. You don't need more information. You've already reached your conclusion. And I have to say, I've done it. And I've caught myself doing something else. Sometimes I'll be listening to somebody, but instead of listening to understand what they're actually saying, I'm already preparing my response. I'm thinking about what they said before. I'm connecting it to something else. I'm interpreting. I'm deciding. And suddenly, I'm not really listening to the person in front of me anymore. I'm listening to the version of them that I have created in my head. And that's worth noticing. This is where I've really been thinking. What are we losing when we stop being curious? Because I think the world has gotten less curious and we miss so much because we assume before we confirm. We see, we interpret, we decide, and then we move on. But what if we just stayed just a little longer? What if we asked another question? What if we actually wanted to know the person instead of simply knowing about them. Because I think something else is happening. We're losing depth. Often we just scratch the surface. We can know someone's name, we can know what they do, we can know what they posted, we can know where they went, we can know what they're like, and still not really know them. And that's something to think about because being around people isn't necessarily the same thing as knowing people. And I wonder if we become really good at staying on the surface, not because we don't care, we're busy, we're moving, we're checking the phone, and we're thinking about the next thing. We're listening just long enough to respond. And sometimes we just don't take the time to go deeper. And I am guilty of it. What about you? When was the last time you were genuinely curious about somebody? Not curious because you needed information, curious because you wanted to know them. That's different because curiosity says, tell me more. Curiosity says, help me understand. Curiosity says, there may be something here that I haven't seen yet. And that little bit of room can change a conversation. Maybe I misunderstood you. Maybe I don't have the whole story. Maybe there is something happening in your life right now that I know nothing about. Maybe what I saw wasn't the whole picture. Maybe what I heard wasn't what you meant. And here's something I really want us to think about. What if I don't have to change my mind to become curious? I can have an opinion, I can have experience, I can have strong convictions, and I can still ask a question. I can still say, tell me more. That doesn't weaken what I know, it gives me an opportunity to discover what I don't know. There is still so much I don't know. And actually, I kind of like that because if I already knew everything, there wouldn't be much left to discover. There wouldn't be much room for surprise. And your girl likes surprises. There wouldn't be much room for wonder. And I think we need more of that, more wonder, more curiosity, more willingness to say, hmm, I hadn't thought about it that way. And that's a beautiful sentence because it means something new just entered the room. Think about how often we turn people into stories. Someone is quiet, they're stuck up. Someone doesn't respond, they're ignoring me. Someone makes a career change, they couldn't handle the job. Someone succeeds, they're just lucky. We create the explanation before we gathered the information. And I wonder how many times we have been certain about a story that wasn't actually true. Not because we're bad people, because we're human. Our minds want to make sense of things. But here's the danger. Once we've decided what something means, we stop looking for what it might actually mean. And that's where curiosity can change things. So maybe curiosity isn't about questioning everything. Maybe it's about leaving enough room to discover what you haven't seen yet. I can ask, what am I missing? Without throwing away what I already know. I can ask, is there another way to see this? without deciding that my way is wrong. I can ask, what else could be true without becoming gullible? Curiosity doesn't mean believing everything you hear. It doesn't mean ignoring discernment. It doesn't mean accepting behavior that's totally unacceptable. It simply means I'm willing to gather before I conclude. And I think that's important because sometimes our first interpretation isn't right, and sometimes it is right. The question is, are we curious enough to find out? And this is where curiosity gets really interesting to me because this isn't just about people. We do this with possibilities too. We see a job description and we say, I couldn't do that. We hear an idea and we say, that won't work. Someone suggests something different and we say, hmm, we've tried that before. We see something unfamiliar and say, that's not for me. And maybe it isn't. But did we investigate before we decided? Did we ask? Did we explore? Did we give ourselves enough information to make that decision? Because there are some things you simply cannot know from the outside. You have to participate. You have to explore. You have to experience. You have to be willing to discover. And sometimes you discover, nope, definitely not for me. And that's okay. Curiosity doesn't require a yes. It gives you enough openness to find out before you decide. And I think this is where I've landed. Curiosity doesn't require you to change your mind. It requires you to be willing to find out if your mind needs changing. And maybe that's the part we've forgotten. Sometimes we're not missing an answer, we're missing a question. We decided too quickly. We concluded too early. We stopped looking. We stopped asking. We stopped wondering. And when curiosity disappears, possibility can disappear with it. Because once I've decided, I know, I've closed the door to discovering anything else. But when I say, I wonder, I've created room for information, room for understanding, room for creativity, room for another possibility. And sometimes room is exactly what we need. And here's another thing that I've been thinking about. Curiosity isn't just about what we discover, it's about who we become while we're discovering. Wow, that's good right there. When I'm curious, I'm learning, I'm listening, I'm stretching, I'm considering, I'm allowing something outside of my current understanding to enter the room. And that means I'm not finished. None of us are. If I've decided that I've seen everything there is to see, understand, or understood everything there is to understand, and figured everybody out, where's the room for me to grow? Where's the room for me to wonder? Where's the room for me to be creative? Where's the room for wisdom that I hadn't gained yet? Maybe becoming requires us to remain curious. Because how do I become more if I already decide that I know enough? How do I discover something new if I've decided there's nothing new to discover? Not naive, not gullible, not indecisive, curious. because I don't want to become so certain about who I am that I leave no room for who I can still become. Now that's something. And maybe somebody just came to mind. Maybe you've already decided what they're about. Maybe you've already decided what that conversation is going to be like. Maybe you've already decided what they meant. Maybe you've already decided what they're capable of. Maybe you've already decided that that opportunity isn't for you. And I'm not telling you that your conclusion is wrong. I'm asking, did you get curious before you decided? Because sometimes we don't need to change our conclusion. We simply need to make sure we didn't arrive at the conclusion before we had enough information. Think about what could change if we became just a little more curious because we assume somebody's intention. Mm-mm. Ask. Before we dismiss an idea, explore it. And before we decide we're not capable, get curious about what we could learn. And before we decide someone cannot change, leave room for what you don't know. Before you decide something isn't possible, ask one more question. I'm not saying abandon your wisdom. I'm saying don't let your certainty become so complete that there is no room left for discovery because there is still so much we don't know. And that's not a problem, that's an invitation. So let me leave you with something to think about. What have I already decided that I haven't really investigated? Think about the person, the opportunity, the idea, the situation, the possibility. What have you already decided? And what might happen if, instead of immediately defending your conclusion, you become curious about it? You don't have to change your mind. You don't have to agree. You don't have to say yes. Just be willing to find out because you might discover that your first conclusion was right. But you might also discover something you couldn't see while you were certain. And that discovery could change everything. So as you move through this week, I want you to leave a little room. When you hear yourself say, I already know, give yourself a moment, ask another question, listen a little longer, look again, not because you are wrong, because you may not have the whole picture. When you make room for curiosity, you make room for possibilities you couldn't see before. You make room for people to surprise you. You make room for ideas to develop. You make room for possibilities you may have dismissed too quickly. And you make room for yourself to keep learning. So don't be in such a hurry to know. Be willing to wonder. Ask the question, listen for the answer, and give yourself enough room to discover something you couldn't see before. If this conversation made you think of someone or something that you may have already decided about, share it with them. And if you want to keep having conversations that make you stop, think, and see something a little differently, follow or subscribe to Forward in Freedom. The fog is lifting. Clarity is calling you forward. This is where awareness becomes power. Let's move forward in freedom. I'm Tanya J.